Hi, everybody. So this is our third folk music genre, and we've already looked at kind of recreational music, and then we looked at religious music. This is the folk music of people who are at work, right? So it's about the same time period. We're talking about the early 1800s, but in this context, we're talking about rural South, right, or the rural West in some cases, out in farms. And we're also talking about the Old West, right? Cowboys going all the way out and people pioneers, if you will. And we are also going to talk about sailing ships, people who are singing and working aboard sailing ships. There's all kinds of other work music out there. There's tons of songs that are about railroad work that come about later. But in this video, we're really going to focus probably more on the three types of plantation or prison work songs. Field hollers is what they're sometimes called. Sea shanties, which are the folks who are singing, who are working as sailors, and cowboy songs. In these songs, typically you're talking about just vocals in many cases, and sometimes body percussion, the hand claps or improvised instruments. So you might hear the sound of people hammering or hoeing or working, pulling ropes if they're on a ship. The purpose is pace setting, right? And the overriding reason why people sang in work was in order to set a slow, moderate pace to prevent people from going too fast and showing everybody else up or wearing themselves out, and also to prevent people from going too slow. And it's also it raises your spirits while potentially you're working in incredibly difficult situations. So again, we're going to look at the historical context, then the audio elements, some of the musicians and songs to know, and then we'll wrap with the song analysis guide. So historical context, it's important to realize that both sea shanties and field hollers, those farm songs, are in use by the late 1700s to help workers keep pace. It's been something we've been doing for hundreds of years. Cowboy songs became pretty common in the mid 1800s as cowboy ranching became popular. So a lot of those songs come about in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. There's a few that are later than that as well, like Home on the Range, for example, that are more about pioneer life than cowboy songs specifically. The other piece of historical context to know is that before the Civil War, right, field hollers are used as plantation work songs for enslaved people who were, in many cases, just expected or required to sing. That was partially to keep track of workers, right? You could hear a group of people if in the field working if they were singing, so it was easy to locate them, kind of like attaching a cowbell to a cow. After after the Civil War, the justice system in the American South evolved to basically re-enslave freed Black people as prison workforces. There's a really famous book called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman that describes it in really agonizing detail, how basically the South created this prison system, the criminal justice system, in an effort to re-enslave people. I've got a photo down here from I believe it's California in the 1840s, and you can see, or no, that's New Mexico in the 1840s. I'll double check that, but you can see some cowboys, messing around with their cows and whatnot. Over here is actually a whale tooth, and so it's the tooth of a sperm whale that was caught near the Galapagos Islands in the South Pacific in 1817. And there's a good example of kind of what folks would do is they would do what's called scrimshaw. They would engrave on the teeth there, and that's a little boat. And you can see these are the kinds of folks that would be singing sea shanties, right? So this is actually from a album notes from an album called Prison Work Songs that was recorded in the 1940s and 1950s by a doctor who works, Dr. Larry Oster at the Smithsonian, and the album came out in 1959. And he wrote, this is really tough stuff, but it describes really how brutal this southern plantation farm system became when it became prisons. And in many cases, you should know, the plantations in the South, in many cases, were converted into prisons. And today they still exist, right? Angola still exists in Louisiana with brutal, terrible conditions. Parchman Farm in Mississippi is another pretty popular one that is often referred to in this context. There's a prisoner named Roosevelt Charles who was talking with Dr. Oster in 1959, and he said, matters of fact, the times got modern and they stopped slaving as they used to. Now, keep in mind, this guy is talking about slaving as basically the arresting of young Black men to force them to work on prison farms. And also the young race, and he's talking about younger people, about singing, the young race is not as interested in the work song now, and they would get to working together. And he's describing the reasoning here. All would be working together, which would make the work far more easier than it is to do, far more easier to do. And to go singing and working, and the day would slowly pass away faster than it would getting out there and working and not saying anything. So he's describing why do you sing? And then he says, actually, this is kind of the sad part. He says, the fresh fish are not interested in the old things. The first thing you hear one of them fresh fish holler is, it's modern days now. We're not interested in that old John Henry stuff because that was slavery time. And we're going to actually listen to a rendition of John Henry sung by men who were imprisoned in the 1930s at Parchment Farm. But it's just a terribly brutal conditions. And you can imagine that songs, in many cases, provide a way for men, and there are some female prisons, but it's overwhelmingly men, to cope, right, with these brutal terroristic conditions, of beatings and floggings, and it's just awful. Musicians are typically lower class adults, right? When we're talking about work songs, these are folks who, both black and white, they're on the fringe of society. They're the poorest of the poor, and they have really hard lives. Sea shanties and cowboy songs are almost exclusively male. Females weren't really part of the sailor context in that era, and cowboy songs as well. There are females out there who are cowboys and sailors, but overwhelmingly the music we have are from males. Field hollers are sung by both genders, although in prison songs they're usually gender segregated. And the audiences are singers themselves. We talked about why, keeping a work pace and recreation. Subject matters are sometimes nonsense. Like, the words don't really make a whole lot of sense. They aren't designed really for that sometimes. Sometimes there's romance songs, about lost or missing love and how you miss somebody. Companionship, particularly in a prison work song. Or if you're a sailor, some of these voyages to go on a whaling voyage in 1820 would be a 2-year voyage, right? You would leave, your harbor from Baltimore, and you wouldn't come back for 2 years. And that's a good voyage, right? A bad one, you might be gone 3 years. And the challenges of that could be really tough. So this is a photograph of Parchment Farm from about 1900, and I think it illustrates what's going on in these places, right? You have men here hoeing, wearing, this striped prisoner uniform. You have a white overseer overseeing virtually an all black group here, working together, and they probably were singing, as part of this as well, to keep the pace. Instruments and vocals, right? We already talked about how it's almost always groups, unless we're talking about cowboy songs where it's usually a solo cowboy singer. Often there's improvised percussion, or it's just the sound of the work tools. So if you're a cowboy, it might literally be, the clopping of your horse that you're kind of singing with. Sea shanties actually sometimes have violins or accordions, and that's what we've got this barefoot guy over here living his best life playing an accordion. Living out at sea, singing one of those. The other thing I'll mention really briefly about sea shanties is that they have different songs for different tasks. I skipped over that this timbre part. They're often breathy and reflect the hard work. But sea shanties often have different tempos for different tasks, right? You have maybe a song where you're hauling in an anchor, or you're hauling in certain rope, or you're letting rope out and you're letting sails out. There's forecastle songs, and there's a zillion of them. And each song has a different tempo and a different kind of structure designed for that. They do have some that are the jig, the reel songs that are for dancing, but those aren't really work songs. They're more just songs that you sing because you're stuck on a ship. Field hollers are typically a slow drag song. They're designed to set a pretty slow, moderate pace. You could have moderate tempo prison work songs if you're hammering or cutting things, and there are some good songs like Poe Lazarus, for example. That's a good example of that. Cowboy songs are usually pretty slow because your gait, right? The horse is walking slowly. And there's very little pitch modulation. These songs are pretty much monotone in many cases, unless you've got a good call and response with a group of singers, and maybe you have the lead who's singing kind of in an expressive way. But generally speaking, if you're hard at work, you're not trying to be that expressive. You're just singing to keep the pace. Here's some good singers to know about. We don't know about many of the performers from the early 1800s. Those are ordinary folk, just like we've already talked about with the others. But from the early 20th century, we do have performers who were imprisoned, right? So we have folks like Leadbelly, this fellow over here, and an absolute giant of performing music. He's a blues singer, but he's also well known for these work songs. And he was recorded originally while he was imprisoned. So he was imprisoned in the South, and he was approached by a song catcher, right, a folk music collector, and they recorded him. And then after his release from prison, he became really very popular. Woody Guthrie, Cisco Houston, Paul Clayton, these two gentlemen and the guy who I'll show you in a second, they were not cowboys. They were not workers themselves, although Woody Guthrie kind of is a borderline there. What they are people who want to practice the art of these songs. They play these songs. Woody Guthrie is also a composer, so we'll show you him in a second. He plays lots of field work and railroad songs. Cisco Houston played cowboy songs. That's this guy over here. He's just got a really unique voice and a beautiful way of singing, and he's got his guitar here. He recorded a lot in the 1940s and 50s. Paul Clayton was this young kid who he sang a lot of sea shanties. You can see he died so young. A lot of these guys did. Paul Clayton took his own life, unfortunately. He was gay, and he had a really hard time of coping with a lot of the homophobia of that era. But he was a really, really well-known singer of sea shanties. He fell in love with the sea. The Georgia Sea Island Singers are a traditional group. We've talked about them before. They sang traditional African music and spirituals, but also some fieldwork songs. And they were a group that existed for a lot of the 20th century. This is Woody Guthrie. I can't say enough cool things about him. He was a remarkable man, born poor in Oklahoma. He grew up learning the folk music of work songs and railroad songs and blues and country western songs of the 1920s and 30s. And in the 1930s, he became the preeminent singer about the Dust Bowl. Because obviously the Dust Bowl was an enormous impact on Oklahoma. He wrote hundreds of songs that even today people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was Woody Guthrie's music. He's probably most well known today for his really left-wing politics. You can see his guitar notably had a bumper sticker on it that said, "This machine kills fascists." And the original Antifa, if you will. He wrote the song "This Land Is Your Land," and you probably know that song. The lyrics to it, a lot of them are about how private property is really encroaching on our freedoms. And he actually was so angry at a different song, "God Bless America," which Irving Berlin wrote, and it's a super patriotic song. He was so mad that it constantly was getting played that he decided, I'm going to sit down and write a better patriotic song, a real patriotic song about this land is your land. And today it's one of the most popular songs of the United States. So 3 songs to check out. Again, I'm going to put the link up here in the playlist. John Henry, there's a few versions in the playlist that you should listen to. There's a version by Woody Guthrie in the playlist. There's a version by Leadbelly in the playlist. Both of those are up-tempo dance versions of this song. They're designed for recreation, right? Recreational folk music. The version that I think you really need to check out is by Benny Richardson and some men who are imprisoned at Parchman Farm. These guys are being brutalized by the system, right? And it's crushing them. They are recorded doing this version as a fieldwork song, and it's pretty powerful. The Rio Grande is a traditional sea shanty. It's one of the most popular songs because it's got such great vocals and expression in it. It was sung by sailors as they left port, and it was kind of designed to impress people. It's a forecastle song, so they were hauling in anchors and doing some things to leave port. The Rio Grande that's referred to in the song is not the river in Mexico and the United States. It's a region actually in South America. And so this was a popular song sung by nearly every ship in the early 1800s. The Dying Cowboy is another one of that era, 1840 or so. Cisco Houston sings a version of it that's just really powerful. It's about fear. Think about a cowboy, you're living by yourself. In many cases, you and a couple guys, and it's the fear of dying and being buried alone on the prairie. So it's a haunting song, a beautiful song indeed. So check those out. The song analysis guide, we'll do that one in class. There's tons of great linked resources here in the slide deck if you want to read more about these folks and about the prison system and all of these other things. Hopefully this helped you. I'll see you next time.